So the last time we were together, we were talking about these captains of industry and these robber barons, and how these men were viewed differently depending on your perspective. What I want to do today is I want to dive into and specifically meet and learn about one of these business leaders who, in the end, you're going to have to decide whether or not you think was a captain of industry or a robber baron. And today we get to meet Andrew Carnegie. Hopefully that's a name that you recognize. Anybody know why you might recognize that name, Carnegie? If you grew up in Pittsburgh like I did, that's a name that's very recognizable because it's everywhere in the Pittsburgh area. How many of you have ever been to the Carnegie Science Center? Anyone ever been to the Carnegie Museum of Art? The Carnegie Museum of Natural History, that's where the dinosaur bones are. Well, Carnegie's name is on all kinds of towns and streets and libraries and roads and museums and buildings and things in the Pittsburgh area because that's where he was from. We are going to learn a little bit more about this guy, besides the fact that he did settle and make his fortune in the Pittsburgh area. He is a Scottish immigrant. His parents came to this country from Scotland, and they ended up settling in Pittsburgh. Andrew Carnegie was a very successful man at a very young age. And a lot of that had to do with probably his upbringing, but also because of just some genetic fortune that he had. He was very bright, he was smart, he was a fast learner, he was very hardworking, he was very ambitious. He had all of these character traits that really were going to benefit him as he tried to make his way in this country as a young immigrant. And by the age of 18, he is already starting to make a name for himself in the Pittsburgh region and in the world of big business. He works as a young man. I believe he worked delivering telegraphs in the Pittsburgh area as a very young kid. And that meant that he had contact with a lot of the business leaders of the time in the Pittsburgh area as this era of industry was growing and developing. And he made a good impression on people because of him being so smart, because of his ambition, because of his hard work ethic and things like that. And by age 18, he gets brought into the railroad industry. And he works on the Pennsylvania Railroad Company and starts at a very young age making a lot of good money and kind of making his way up through the company. One of the things that Andrew Carnegie learns very young is this idea of trying to find ways to have your money make more money for you. And that's where the investing thing comes in. He starts looking for opportunities to invest his money in new businesses and new opportunities and new products and new industries and so on and so forth. Eventually, the business that he will find his success in, I'm hoping that a lot of you know this already because of the connection with our local area, is the steel industry. Eventually, Andrew Carnegie recognizes, does anybody remember the name of that process that was developed to convert iron into steel cheaply, quickly, and easily? The Bessemer process. Andrew Carnegie saw this as an opportunity for the future. When the Bessemer converter was invented and Henry Bessemer put it out there and the steel industry started to become a thing, Carnegie looked at this and he said, man, I think this steel business, I think it's going places. And so he started to invest in that industry. He started to learn about that industry, and eventually he partners up with some other powerful people in the Pittsburgh area, and he, with a partner named Henry Clay Frick, will eventually take over the steel industry, not just in the Pittsburgh area, but eventually he will become the leading steel producer in the world at some point. Carnegie Steel will be producing the majority of the world's steel. He and his partner Henry Clay Frick will be very shrewd business leaders, very smart, also very hardworking, but in some ways maybe a little corrupt as well. They will find ways to drive out their competition. They will undersell their competitors, and eventually they will monopolize the steel industry again, not in the Pittsburgh area, not just in the United States, but basically they will control the entire steel industry in the world. One of the techniques that they use is something that's called vertical integration. We talked earlier about forming monopolies as a way to eliminate your competition. Well, there's different strategies to do that. The strategy that Andrew Carnegie used was something called vertical integration. Sometimes it's called vertical consolidation. And this was a strategy that he used where he figured out ways to take control of every step in the process of creating his product. So in this case, steel. He didn't want to buy anything from anybody else to make his steel. He didn't want to pay anybody any money to provide any kind of services that he might need to produce steel. He wanted to own, operate, and control every step in the process. So I'll kind of simplify it. That meant that Andrew Carnegie will eventually own the coal mines in southern Pennsylvania that mined the coal that he needed in his factories to produce steel. He will partner up with Henry Clay Frick, who owned what were called coke ovens. Coke is a byproduct of mining coal, and it's a chemical thing that you need. It's an ingredient, basically, that you need to make steel. He didn't want to buy that from Henry Clay Frick, so what did he do? He brought Henry Clay Frick in, and they became partners. He didn't want to pay anybody anything for any kind of work that was done in his factories other than his individual workers, but he had control over that. So he owned his own mills. He owned his own Bessemer converters. Eventually, Andrew Carnegie owns his own railroad cars that will deliver the steel to his customers. So from pulling the natural resources, the ingredients to make steel out of the earth, all the way up to transporting it to his customers, he owned and controlled every step in that process. That's called vertical integration. When he did that, he was able to be so efficient. He produced the best steel in the world at the lowest prices, at the most efficient levels, and because of that, he was able to start underselling smaller steel companies that couldn't compete with him. And then once he did that, he could drive them out of business. And at some point, he will gain control of ultimately the entire steel industry in the world, pretty much. Okay, now, one of the other things that Andrew Carnegie is synonymous with, besides his shrewd business acumen and his ability to create this massive empire in the steel industry, was that he becomes very well known for philanthropy. Something that we mentioned earlier, that nice big fancy word from the other day, the other lecture. Nobody epitomized philanthropy at the time more than Andrew Carnegie, and maybe even since. Andrew Carnegie has historically been remembered as a philanthropist, certainly in the Pittsburgh area, but his philanthropy was far-reaching. The biggest contribution that he made, in particular to the Pittsburgh area, was that he became very interested in providing opportunities for people to get education. And so one of his signature philanthropic causes was that he built libraries, over 3,000 libraries all over the Pittsburgh area. If you grew up in the Pittsburgh region, anywhere close to the city of Pittsburgh, and the city of Pittsburgh is really made up of all these small little, what were at one point, a lot of them were steel towns. If you grow up or live in, even today, in one of those little communities, I grew up in a place called McKeesport, which is just outside of the downtown city of Pittsburgh, you have a Carnegie free library in your town. There were thousands of them that he built all over the Pittsburgh area. When I was a kid, I remember going to the Carnegie free library. It was right down the street from my house, and kind of like the next neighborhood over, and I would go there when I was a kid. My parents would take me, we'd take books out, I'd go to classes there, whatever. That library is still running. It's this beautiful old building in McKeesport, and like I said, there are thousands of these all over the Pittsburgh area. He was adamant about providing this opportunity free of charge to the community. And for that, he is considered in the Pittsburgh area to be, one of the great philanthropists of all time. But it's much more than just the libraries that he built. He also took his money and invested it or used it to create foundations. He funded research institutions. He created the whole chain of museums in the Pittsburgh area that have his name on them, those Carnegie museums. He partnered up with Andrew Mellon, another powerful businessman from Pittsburgh at the time, and they created a very prestigious university. I don't know if you ever heard of Carnegie Mellon University. It's right next to the University of Pittsburgh, the Pitt campus, right in downtown Pittsburgh, and of course it has his name on it because he used his money to start this university. And today it's a premier university in our region. So this guy certainly did his part in terms of being a philanthropist. However, there's another side to him, and this is that whole captain of industry versus robber baron thing. He was also at the time very heavily criticized for a lot of his company's labor practices, the way that he treated his workers, the pay that he paid his workers, the working environment that he created, the way that the workers were treated as being expendable sort of cogs in the machine. And there's no greater example of this issue than something we'll learn about a little bit later when we cover the Homestead strike. Homestead, another small town outside of downtown Pittsburgh, where he had a large steel factory. And there was a massive strike in 1892, I believe, where people ended up, there's this violent interaction between Carnegie and the leaders of his business and the workers who were fed up with the way they were being treated. So, you definitely get this captain of industry side and this robber baron side. We're going to learn a little bit more about Andrew Carnegie as we learn about what he called his gospel of wealth. And in the end, you're going to decide which side of this, which part of his image do you think is the one that he should be remembered for. So that's where I'm going to leave it for today. You're going to be doing some work on the gospel of wealth.